She was an aircraft carrier that never launched a single plane in combat, yet she was entrusted with carrying the entire gold reserve of the Bank of France across the treacherous Atlantic at the height of World War II. This is the story of the French aircraft carrier Béarn, a ship born from the bones of a battleship, plagued by a bizarre design, and destined for a strange wartime saga of golden missions and political exile, proving that sometimes a warship's greatest service has nothing to do with firing a single shot. In the early 20th century, the great navies of the world were locked in a frantic arms race, a contest of steel and firepower where the ultimate expression of national power was the dreadnought battleship. France, determined to maintain its status as a premier naval power, laid down a new class of super-dreadnoughts intended to be the pride of its fleet, the Normandy class. 5 of these mighty vessels were planned, each displacing over 25,000 tons and armed with a formidable main battery of 12 massive 340mm guns housed in 3 unique quadruple turrets. The 5th ship of this class, laid down in January 1914, was named Béarn, after the historic French province. But history had other plans. Just a few months later, the guns of August roared to life across Europe, and the continent was plunged into the Great War. Construction on the battleships ground to a halt, as every ounce of French industrial might was redirected to the trenches and the desperate, bloody struggle on the Western Front. The hull of the Béarn, only partially complete, sat silent in its shipyard, a monument to a naval doctrine that was about to be rendered obsolete. When the armistice was finally signed in 1918, the world was a different place. The age of the dreadnought was not over, but a new weapon had proven its potential in the skies above the battlefield, the airplane. Navies began experimenting with crude platforms to launch aircraft from ships, and the idea of the aircraft carrier began to take shape. This new reality was codified in 1922 by the Washington Naval Treaty, an agreement designed to prevent another costly naval arms race by placing strict limits on the tonnage and number of capital ships each nation could possess. The treaty, however, included a clause that became a golden opportunity for naval architects. It allowed signatories to convert up to 2 existing capital ship hulls, either under construction or already in service, into aircraft carriers. For France, the 4 mostly complete Normandy-class battleships were an obvious choice for the scrapyard, but the 5th hull, the Béarn, was spared this fate. She was chosen to become France's first, and for a very long time, only aircraft carrier. It was a decision born of economy and treaty-mandated necessity, and it would create one of the most unconventional warships of the 20th century. Converting a battleship into an aircraft carrier is not a simple matter of slapping a flat deck on top. The 2 ship types are designed for fundamentally different purposes. A battleship is a stable, heavily armored gun platform, while a carrier is a mobile airfield. The hull of the Béarn was wide and sturdy, but it was also designed to support massive, heavy gun turrets and thick armor belts, not a long, open flight deck. The French engineers faced a monumental task, and their solutions were, to put it mildly, unique. The first and most significant problem was propulsion. The original Normandy-class design called for a mix of steam turbines for high speed and steam engines for cruising, a hybrid system that was already becoming outdated. To save money, this system was retained for the Béarn. The result was a power plant that was heavy, complex, and woefully underpowered for a carrier. Her absolute maximum speed was a sluggish 21.5 knots. In an era when new cruisers and destroyers were pushing 35 knots, and even contemporary foreign carriers like the American Lexington class were capable of well over 30 knots, the Béarn was a tortoise in a world of hares. This single characteristic would define her entire career, making her too slow to operate effectively with the modern fleet she was supposed to support. The oddities only began with her engines. To get aircraft from the hangar deck below to the flight deck above, carriers use massive elevators. Most designs placed these elevators along the center line of the flight deck for efficient operation. The engineers working on Béarn, however, came up with a system of bewildering complexity. She had 3 elevators. The one at the stern was conventional enough, a single large platform. But the other two, located forward and amidships, were part of a bizarre multi-stage system. This contraption involved a main lift that brought the plane up to the flight deck, but this lift was then required to slide sideways into a bay before a section of the flight deck slid over to cover the hole. This meant that while the elevator was in use, a giant gaping hole was left in the middle of the landing area, and the entire forward section of the flight deck was unusable. It was a slow, mechanically fraught process that made rapid launching or recovery of aircraft a complete fantasy. Then there was the issue of smoke. A carrier needs to keep the hot, turbulent exhaust from its funnels away from the flight deck to ensure a smooth airflow for landing aircraft. The British and Americans solved this by building a large structure on the side of the deck called an island, which incorporated the bridge and the funnels. The French, seeking a different solution, routed the Béarn's boiler uptakes into two funnels on the starboard side that were designed to be lowered horizontally during flight operations. They also incorporated a complex smoke cooling system that sprayed cold water into the exhaust gases to make them denser, theoretically encouraging the smoke to sink away from the deck. While clever in principle, it was another layer of mechanical complexity on an already overburdened ship. And just to complete the picture of a ship caught between two eras, the Béarn retained a battleship's mentality when it came to armament. Instead of a large number of smaller anti-aircraft guns, she was fitted with 8 heavy 155mm guns mounted in casemates along the side of her hull, just below the flight deck. These were anti-ship guns designed to fight off cruisers and destroyers, a role no other nation envisioned for their carriers. While she did have a secondary battery of anti-aircraft guns, her main armament was a relic, completely unsuited for the realities of aerial warfare. When she was finally commissioned in May of 1927, the Béarn was a floating paradox, a brand new ship that was already, in almost every meaningful way, completely obsolete. Despite her many flaws, the Béarn was all France had. For the next decade, she served as the French Navy's sole laboratory for naval aviation. Aboard her decks, a generation of pilots learned the terrifying and unforgiving art of taking off from and landing on a moving ship. They developed the tactics, the equipment, and the doctrine that would form the basis of all future French carrier operations. She was an essential, if deeply flawed, schoolhouse. The aircraft she operated tell a story of their own, from the strange-looking Levasseur PL-4 biplanes with their boat-like fuselages to the more advanced Dewoitine D-376 fighter planes of the late 1930s. But, throughout this period of experimentation, the fundamental problem of her slow speed never went away. Fleet exercises consistently demonstrated that the Béarn simply could not keep up with the fast new battleships like the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, or the swift destroyers that would screen them. She could either sail with the battle fleet and be unable to generate enough wind over her deck to safely launch her heavily laden torpedo bombers, or she could break away to find a favorable wind, leaving herself dangerously exposed without the fleet's protective anti-aircraft umbrella. It was an unsolvable riddle. By the time the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe in 1939, the French Naval Command had accepted the inevitable. Their only aircraft carrier was a liability, unfit for frontline combat against a modern navy. When World War II began in September 1939, the Béarn was relegated to the role of an aircraft transport, ferrying planes from French colonies in North Africa to the mainland. It was a far cry from the dramatic carrier battles naval theorists had envisioned, but it was a role she could perform safely, far from the main theatres of operation. However, in the spring of 1940, as Hitler's armies prepared to unleash their blitzkrieg on France, the Béarn would be called upon for a mission of unparalleled importance, one that had nothing to do with airplanes and everything to do with economics. As the German advance proved unstoppable, a terrible panic gripped the French government. One of their most valuable national assets was the massive gold reserve of the Bank of France, hundreds of tons of solid gold bullion. If this fell into German hands, it would be a catastrophic economic blow. A decision was made to move the gold to the safety of Canada. Codenamed Operation Bullion, the plan called for the French Navy to transport this immense treasure across the submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic. The cruiser Émile Bertin carried the first shipment, but a much larger vessel was needed for the main bulk of the reserve. The Navy chose the Béarn. Her large open hangar deck made her an ideal vessel for storing vast quantities of cargo, and her slow speed was less of a liability in a heavily escorted convoy. In May of 1940, as the Battle of France raged, the Béarn sailed from Toulon on a secret and vital mission. She rendezvoused with other French warships, loaded a staggering 200 tons of gold, and set a course for Halifax, Nova Scotia. And here, in my opinion, is where the Béarn's story transforms from one of military mediocrity into a truly fascinating historical saga. This flawed, awkward ship, a vessel considered a failure by many, was now the guardian of her nation's entire financial future. The fate of France, in a very real sense, rested in her aging, hybrid engines. Having safely delivered her golden cargo, the Béarn did not return to a collapsing France. Instead, she was tasked with another critical mission, sailing to the United States to collect brand new, desperately needed combat aircraft that had been purchased from American manufacturers. She loaded on a consignment of 44 Curtiss H-75 fighters, 47 Brewster Buffalo fighters, and 25 Stinson 105 utility planes. But while she was steaming across the Atlantic, her nation ceased to exist. On the 22nd of June 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The government collapsed, and the collaborationist Vichy regime rose from its ashes. The crew of the Béarn received the shocking news while at sea. Their orders were now to head for the French-controlled island of Martinique in the Caribbean. When she dropped anchor in Fort-de-France in late June, the Béarn sailed into a 4-year state of political limbo. Her arrival created a massive geopolitical headache for the United States. On the island were not only a semi-modern aircraft carrier and a flotilla of French cruisers, but also a portion of the French gold reserve that had been moved there earlier. The American government, while officially neutral at this point, was deeply committed to aiding Britain and was terrified that these valuable assets might fall into German hands through the Vichy government. An incredibly tense standoff began. The American Navy established a constant patrol off the coast of Martinique, with destroyers and cruisers keeping a watchful eye on the French fleet. The governor of the island, Admiral Georges Robert, was a staunch traditionalist loyal to the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain. He refused to cooperate with the Americans or to consider joining the Free French forces of General Charles de Gaulle. And so the Béarn sat, swinging at her mooring, a pawn in a global chess match. The brand new American aircraft she carried, which were so desperately needed by the Allies, were unloaded and taken to a field on the island. And there they sat, for years, cocooned in protective coverings under the brutal Caribbean sun. The humid, tropical climate took its toll. Day by day, week by week, month by month, these pristine warplanes slowly corroded and rusted away, rendered useless without ever flying a single mission. Can you imagine the frustration of the pilots and crews? To have a carrier and modern planes, but to be forced into total inaction by politics an ocean away, all while a world war raged on. It's a perfect storm of military irony. For nearly 4 years, the Béarn and her crew remained in this state of suspended animation. Life aboard the ship settled into a monotonous routine of maintenance and waiting. Finally, in June of 1943, after the Allied invasion of North Africa and the subsequent German occupation of the rest of France, the political tide turned. Admiral Robert was forced to relinquish control of Martinique, and the French forces on the island, including the crew of the Béarn, finally sided with the Free French. The ship was free, but she was in no condition to fight. Years of neglect in a tropical climate had left her machinery in a deplorable state. Her armament was obsolete, her design was still flawed, and the aircraft she was meant to carry were now heaps of corroded scrap metal. In December of 1943, the old carrier steamed under her own power, just barely, to the American naval base in New Orleans for a massive overhaul. The American shipyards, however, had no time or resources to waste on restoring a ship that was, by the standards of 1944, a complete museum piece. The war in the Pacific was dominated by massive Essex-class and Independence-class carriers, ships that could travel at over 30 knots and carry close to 100 modern aircraft. The Béarn was a relic from another age. The decision was made not to refit her as a combat carrier, but to convert her into something she was far better suited for, a dedicated aircraft transport. Her bizarre elevator system was ripped out, her case-mated guns were removed, and her entire design was simplified to maximize her cargo-carrying capacity. Her anti-aircraft armament was significantly upgraded with modern American-made Bofors and Oerlikon cannons, giving her a much-needed ability to defend herself. She finally emerged from the shipyard in March of 1945, just as the war in Europe was reaching its conclusion. Her brief service at the tail end of the war was inauspicious. While undergoing post-refit trials, she suffered a collision with the troop transport USS J.W. McAndrew, resulting in significant casualties on both ships. It was another stroke of bad luck in a career defined by it. After repairs, she finally began her new life, ferrying aircraft and personnel across the Atlantic. The war ended before she could contribute in any significant way, but her service was far from over. In the post-war world, France was desperate to re-establish control over its colonial empire, particularly in French Indochina, which we now know as Vietnam. The Béarn, as one of the few large transport vessels available to the French Navy, was pressed into constant service. For years, she shuttled back and forth between France and the Far East, carrying soldiers, equipment, and a constant supply of new aircraft for the French forces fighting there. It was demanding, unglamorous work, but it was absolutely vital. She performed this duty reliably throughout the First Indochina War. As newer, more capable ships became available, the aging Béarn was finally retired from transport duty in the mid-1950s. But even then, her story wasn't over. Her large hull still had value, and she was converted one last time, this time into a submarine tender and barracks ship for the French submarine flotilla based in Toulon. For another decade, the old warrior served as a floating home and workshop for submariners, her flight deck, which had once been intended for launching biplanes, now used for crew recreation. Finally, in 1967, after a career spanning 40 years under the French flag, the decision was made to scrap the old ship. She was towed to Italy, and the vessel that had started life as a dreadnought, served as an experimental carrier, acted as a floating bank vault, spent years in tropical exile, and found a new purpose as a transport, was finally broken up. The legacy of the Béarn is a complicated one. Judged purely as an aircraft carrier, she was an undeniable failure. She was too slow, her design was too flawed, and she was obsolete the day she was commissioned. She never saw combat in her intended role, and her story is a textbook example of the dangers of trying to force a ship into a role for which it was never designed. But that is too simple a verdict. She was a necessary first step for the French Navy, a crucial training platform that built the foundation of their naval aviation expertise. And in her strange, meandering career, she performed missions of immense national importance. She saved the French economy by transporting its gold reserve to safety. She served as a political bargaining chip that kept valuable assets out of enemy hands, and she provided decades of reliable, if unglamorous, service as a transport and a tender. Her story is a powerful reminder that the worth of a warship cannot always be measured in battles won or enemies sunk. The Béarn was the unluckiest carrier, the ship that was always in the wrong place at the wrong time, but she served her country with a quiet distinction that is unmatched in the annals of naval history. The story of the Béarn is really a story of compromise and adaptation. It shows that sometimes the most important contribution a warship makes is not the one its designers planned. What do you think? Does a ship like the Béarn, with its vital non-combat missions, deserve to be remembered as a success despite its failures as a weapon of war? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. And if you appreciate these deep dives into the forgotten corners of military history, make sure you get your commission, hit that subscribe button, and join our ranks. The Animated General has plenty more missions on the horizon.